All right, I think we're good to get started. So I'll go ahead. Okay, good. Okay. My name is Mallory Harris, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Biology at Stanford, studying infectious diseases, and I'm also the co-president of Scientists Speak Up. So we're a graduate student organization at Stanford that trains our members on how to combat misinformation and effectively communicate about scientific topics seen as controversial, so such as climate change, evolution, vaccination. And I think we have a slide with a little bit more information about us. That we'll get in a second. This year, we're going to be taking a closer look at how topics become controversial to start with. So, for example, through the coordinated denialist campaigns described in the Merchants of Doubt, or the propagation of false or misleading claims on social media, as we'll discuss today. I believe that understanding this context and training scientists on how to respond is critical to ensuring that our work is used responsibly to improve lives and make good decisions. If you have ideas on workshops or speaker panels we can host, we have a Google form, which is linked on this slide that SSU suggests. And you can also join our listserv, which is the second link, if you'd like to hear about our future public events, and then you can contact us, all of that information at the bottom of the screen. Back to our event today. So misinformation on topics ranging from masks to treatments to vaccines has been a major obstacle in our response to this pandemic. In a recent advisory, the US Surgeon General declared that health misinformation is an urgent threat to public health. I've often felt personally pretty frustrated seeing people I'm close to falling prey to this misinformation and really helpless about what to do. That's why I'm so excited to learn from this panel of experts who have done extensive research on COVID misinformation and also online misinformation more broadly. One thing that I really love about all of their work is it really exemplifies how understanding the way misinformation spreads online can help us become better equipped to respond to it. I hope everyone leaves this webinar feeling empowered to address misinformation whenever they encounter it. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. Each of our panelists will give a brief presentation on their work, and then we'll move to a Q&A session. Throughout the webinar, you can submit questions for our panelists in the chat, and then I'll try to get through as many as possible. And then one more fun fact before we get started, that everyone on this panel today is either a current or former Stanford student, which I think speaks to the quality of work happening here around this topic, and also our responsibility as an institution to help amplify these experts and listen to what they're saying. So on that note, I'm really proud to introduce Chase Small as our first speaker. He's a Stanford student and researcher at the Stanford Internet Observatory, and he's currently the lead research analyst for the Virality Project, which is a coalition of research entities focused on supporting real-time information exchange between the misinformation research community, public health officials, government agencies, civil society organizations, and social media platforms. Some of the work he's been involved with was actually referenced in the Surgeon General's recent advisory on health misinformation. And I'm really excited he could join us today. So Chase, take it away.
Thank you for that really kind introduction, Mallory. Let me just share my slides real quick. Well, thanks for having me. It's really an honor to be here. And as Mallory noted, the Virality Project really is looking at being a coordinating body for this sort of cross-society response to COVID-19 vaccine misinformation. It was actually inspired by our work we did in the fall, focused on the 2020 US election. And since January, we've been pivoting to focus on vaccines. So today I want to spend some time looking at the narratives, the main narratives we've been seeing online throughout the pandemic around vaccines. I want to take a couple of minutes to dive into one case study that I think really exemplifies how, preposterous pieces of misinformation can actually gain traction online. And then end by talking about a little bit where the conversation is now headed online in the vaccine space. So to that end, we do our analysis tracks community discussions. So we look at public pages and groups and use sort of keyword searches to get a sense of the spread of vaccine mis and disinformation online. So this includes creating lists of actors we know continue to fuel anti-vaccine narratives and scoped queries based on the narratives we expect to see. And the reason we're able to sort of identify these narratives quickly and in real time is really the big idea here is the narratives we've been seeing throughout COVID-19, the pandemic, targeting the vaccines, they've been consistent and they're largely similar to the anti-vaccine narratives that have existed for decades around other vaccines as well. So I like to say that, the main anti-vaccine advocates are not very creative in sort of how they package these narratives and the tactics they use to share these. And this is really a key opportunity for the pro-vaccine and the pro-science community to be ahead of this communication. So I want to take a look at the four main categories of narratives we look at. And the first and largest of these categories has to do with vaccine safety. So these are concerns that the COVID-19 vaccines are unsafe. Largely, we see a lot of discussion about these vaccines being sort of quote unquote experimental. And I think a big point here is that the anti-vaccine community really focuses on anecdotes that are difficult to verify to sort of push forward COVID-19 vaccine misinformation about safety. So we see a lot of stories gaining attention of people who die or have severe symptoms after receiving a vaccine. And these really fall into this sort of content moderation gray area because sometimes there's a lot of truth in these stories. People do die, unfortunately, after receiving a vaccine, but as a lot of us here know, the causation is often difficult to establish. More often than not, it's not because of the vaccine. But these headlines, like you see on this slide here, their implication that the vaccine causes death or serious injury can really be a sort of personal, tragic anecdote that gets a lot of attention and fuels a lot of outrage online. The second main category we track has to do with the efficacy of vaccines and really kind of concerns about even the necessity of vaccines. So we see sort of, again, individuals, cases of people who get COVID even after being vaccinated. We're seeing that a lot now with the Delta variant and breakthrough cases. And oftentimes these stories lack the context of the big point here is that these people who are now vaccinated have a much lower chance of hospitalization or severe COVID. And again, seek to kind of fuel outrage and confusion. And I'll also note that one sort of trope here that anti-vaccine activists harp on is this idea of natural immunity. If you've had COVID already, you don't need a vaccine, or just in general that our immune system is for some reason, strong enough to defend against COVID. This oftentimes really largely focuses on lowering the perceived risk of COVID-19 itself. Third, we see a lot of discussions around distribution. This has to do around vaccine passports and mandates. This has actually been an ongoing shift in the past decade of anti-vaccine organizing online, where since kind of platform content moderation has increased, we've seen a sort of pivot towards more of a political angle of these sort of health freedom groups, where they're not specifically explicitly focused on anti-vaccine discussions. They're more, just asking questions about the kind of political angle, the policy angle. And their tagline is often, when there's risk, there must be choice. Again, sort of seeking to elevate the perceived risk of vaccines in the context of fear of government overreach. And then fourth and finally, we see a lot of sort of conspiracy theories around vaccines. You may have heard of, the idea that vaccines have microchips or this side of the end times sort of mark of the beast. These get a lot of attention for sort of how preposterous they are, but oftentimes are really mostly taken seriously in sort of their fringe conspiracy theory communities. So the big idea here, we have seen these narratives persistent throughout the pandemic, and we can expect to continue to see them throughout the vaccine rollout. And so with that in mind, I want to take a second and pivot here towards a case study that I think really exemplifies sort of how something that's seemingly preposterous can gain traction online using these sort of anti-vaccine tactics and tropes that have been around for a long time. And that has to do with the magnet challenge. So for those of you who don't know about the magnet challenge, and I'm really hoping most of you do not know about the magnet challenge, the magnet challenge was a series of videos that we first saw emerge sort of in late April, early May. Sort of the big kickoff point was this May 9th viral TikTok video that got over 9.5 million views in just 4 days. And the videos purported to show people putting magnets on their vaccine injection sites and later on other parts of their bodies as well, to get people asking questions about what sort of, whether the vaccine was actually making us magnetic, and from there, kind of what was in the vaccine. In just a month, by early June, you may have seen articles about this. Anti-vaccine advocates were actually, putting keys on themselves and bringing this up in the Ohio State Legislature as sort of proof that their vaccines were dangerous, were unsafe, that we shouldn't be mandating these vaccines. And so it really had this offline effect. So what happened in a month? How did this really catch on? I think there's really 2 points here that really played into the virality and traction of this. The first, what we were looking at is there was this magnet challenge format really invited users into a participatory nature to create their own content. So throughout May, we saw hundreds of these videos on TikTok and on across all major platforms where people sort of we're also putting magnets on their vaccine injection sites. And there's a number of reasons, including tape or lotions or other reasons that a small object might stick to your arm that doesn't have to do with the vaccine. But nevertheless, this really caught on. And even sort of satirical content like this video here clearly was satirical in nature. Even this sort of satirical or debunking content really had the impact of elevating the hashtag magnet challenge and elevating the idea that the vaccines cause magnetism. And sure enough, on May 20th, we saw this well-known anti-vaccine account, the High Wire from Del Bigtree, sort of pushing this forward, asking a question: was this truth or was this the hoax? And this gets to sort of the second thing that's going on here. Is the reason it really gained traction largely has to do with its recycling of a classic anti-vaccine trope. And that's the idea that vaccines can contain some sort of dangerous, maybe metallic ingredient that should be a cause for concern. We've seen this for decades with other vaccines, with concerns about aluminum or mercury in vaccines. And this really, I think, gained traction because it was playing off of this ongoing anti-vaccine trope here. So the bottom line, big takeaway here is the pro-vaccine community was slow to respond. This TikTok video was left up for 4 days, was allowed to amass over 9.5 million views. There are still hundreds of videos online. And people somewhat failed to recognize that this combination of a participatory sort of format along with this recycled anti-vaccine trope gave cause for concern and sort of created this sort of data deficit that trusted sources were slow to fill. Instead, we saw a lot of pseudoscience articles coming out about why magnetism was needed to spread mRNA throughout your body, all these sorts of false explanations for a phenomenon that didn't really exist. So I hope that sort of deep dive for a second gives you a sense of how a specific, sort of ridiculous claim can gain traction. And with that, I want to end by just talking a little bit about where this conversation is shifting online in the past month or so. First has to do with more discussion around vaccination of children. This has been really picking up since the authorization of Pfizer for 12 through 15-year-olds. And I'll note that the anti-vaccine movement really gained traction in the 80s and 90s because of parents concerned about children vaccination. So it's a well-oiled machine at this point. And once again, we have seen the same sort of narratives recycled in targeting children. So stories of children who die or have injuries after receiving a vaccine, some of which are just completely fabricated. Others, again, lack the context of any sort of differentiation between causation and correlation. And second, using real data about how COVID is not as serious of a threat to children to decrease the sort of perceived benefit of vaccination by making it seem like vaccines are unnecessary for children. And so this sort of continues to be where the conversation is moving for children. And then second, and most recently, we've seen a rise in discussion around the Delta variant. But again, these same sort of narratives, a downplaying of the severity of COVID and the thought that vaccines really continue to not be necessary. Once again, concerns about mandates and government overreach in their response to this variant, and even conspiracy theories that link this variant to shadow global health entities that created the variant to further vaccine, scare people into getting vaccines. So with that, I want to conclude there. And really the big idea, big takeaway that I hope you all get from this talk is the idea that these anti-vaccine narratives, these anti-vaccine tropes and tactics, they're all being recycled over and over again throughout the pandemic. And I think that really should be an optimistic note for the pro-science, pro-vaccine community who can use this to get ahead of the conversation. So thank you so much, and I'll turn it back over to Mallory.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chase. And now I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Crystal Lee. Crystal is a PhD candidate at MIT and a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. Previously, she received her undergraduate degree with highest honors at Stanford and also a master's in the history of science. The work she'll be presenting on today was recognized by the Conference on Human Factors in Computing Systems as one of the top 5% of their conference submissions, and she works broadly on topics related to the social and political dimensions of computing, data visualization, and disability. So Crystal, over to you.
Out of curiosity, what slide do you see right now?
I see the more data, more problems.
Is it like the full slide and not just like my speaker notes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, full slide. Great. It looks good.
Great. Thanks so much for everyone on this panel. I am super, super excited to be in conversation with everyone. So I'll try to keep the remarks small so that we can have more discussion. So a bulk of what I'll be talking about today centers around this large project that I launched earlier this year on visualizations about the pandemic. And you can kind of see it in 3 different formats depending on your desired form of communication. So we have this article, which is about 20 pages. There's also an interactive data journalism piece that we put together on all of the data visualizations you can see about COVID skepticism. And there's also a 5-minute video if you want like the true SparkNotes version. But so when I say project and study, what I'm really talking about is this phenomenon that we found where data visualizations about the pandemic really proliferated across social media in ways that we found were really compelling. So for example, I mean, you saw the popularity of charts from people like John Byrne Murdoch at the Financial Times and as usual through the New York Times graphics section. But you know, on visualization Twitter, usually we see a lot of academics talking about like perception or like decreasing cognitive load, or you know, debating whether or not log scales are appropriate ways to visualize the progression of a pandemic. But you don't necessarily see that like suffused within comment sections across the internet, you know, these kind of small granular concerns. And so what we saw anecdotally, this kind of shift towards talking about data visualization more broadly, we really started to really hone in on the kind of features that people were interested in, the kind of infrastructure around data visualizations that made them persuasive and popular. And ultimately, I think I kind of went down a rabbit hole of looking at a lot of alt-right, anti-vax, COVID skeptic groups that really weaponize this rhetoric of, you know, hard data, hard science, like using this kind of like objective approach to decision making that I thought became really toxic as a way of, you know, spreading COVID related misinformation. And I think this kind of weaponization of skepticism is something that has been mirrored in all sorts of different domains, like climate skepticism to like, you know, the unsavory doings, shall we say, of the tobacco industry, for example. So in terms of what I'll be talking about today, I'll have like a general roadmap. So ultimately what the study kind of concludes is that you have data visualizations and, you know, the form and function of them, like what a good visualization looks like actually becomes shared by both anti-mask groups and, you know, people within the scientific community, like the CDC, NIH, or like people who would be publishing articles about the course of the pandemic. But if these visualizations are so similar and they're using similar data, how is it that people come to such different conclusions? So in the first point, we'll say, like, how do these things go wrong? How do people come up with such different reasonings for for the points that they're interested in making. And to that point, like, how does this kind of data analysis work? Like, is there a completely different kind of science that people are doing? I'll talk a little bit about the public reactions to the study that we did, just because I feel like it's interesting to see the dynamic that you describe in a paper like regurgitated back to you by a lot of the people who are exhibiting those characteristics, and then to see like very, very public engagements with other people on this panel to kind of duke out how a lot of the science actually unfolds in public. And then I will inch towards guidelines for moving forward, hopefully to like, set up Carl to like hit a spike. I can't do the sports metaphors, but to set up Carl to like bring us towards what we can very tangibly do and call bullshit where bullshit exists. So how do things go wrong? I think in terms of like the kind of rhetoric, the anti-mask rhetoric that we identified, there are three major sleights of hand, I think is what we call in the paper. So the first is an emphasis primarily on deaths rather than cases. So like shifting the standard of what is statistically significant. The second is a point about lived experience. Do the statistics that they see online or parroted through public health departments, does that match up to their day-to-day life? And third, this is to me the most crucial and interesting point, which is the kind of changing valence that science has in the public life. So I think for a lot of these anti-mask activists and internet users, for them, science was a process and never an institution. So, I mean, because it's something that is so individualized, and this is something that's corroborated by all sorts of other studies on social media, like it's a process for you to reflect by yourself and not something that you should receive on high from an institution like MIT or Stanford. And so there's, I think, a really contested place that expertise plays within this entire ecosystem. So I only have 4 minutes left, so I'll try to speed it up a little bit. But so in terms of cases versus death, on the left, highlighted in green, you'll see one of the popular tweets about how COVID is steadily in decline. And I think what's interesting about this case, so this specific tweet was only shared 8,000 times, but then you saw it like over and over again in like all sorts of different Facebook groups and in other places in social media. And I think it was published in June. And I think what's interesting to me about this specific graphic is that, they capitalize primarily on the death rate declining even as the case rate increases. And so I think there's a kind of titration between different kinds of statistics as it fits specific narratives. But I mean, I think that it also mirrors like whether or not people feel like something is true. So in this specific case, for example, someone is creating a visualization that shows that it's actually quite difficult or quite difficult to actually know someone who has COVID given the small numbers. And I think from these visualizations that seem to match onto their personal experience, that's how they really galvanize a lot of these ideas about how these statistics really just aren't true because they don't match up to their personal experience. But I think a lot of these kind of approaches to science as a process or approaches to thinking about data are things that I would encourage my own students to do, for example. So like thinking about how people are counting cases, like the kind of methods that people are using between specific municipalities and cities and even all the way to the state level, like being attentive to those sources are things that I would tell my students to do when they're looking at their data. But I think certainly there are ways that these ways of being skeptical become like much more contested when you're having this larger conversation with lots of different people at hand. So I think as far as like the kind of analysis that people are doing, there's certainly an emphasis on original content. There's an emphasis on identifying problems with data sources, as I was mentioning before. So people are trying to be curious and skeptical, but I think using that kind of rhetoric by identifying those problems with the sources, by identifying bias, that's where a lot of this kind of misinformation really takes hold, because it has a kind of scientific objective veneer to it. But ultimately, I think it's important to think of data visualizations, data analysis, and science as having a very active social life. So in the same way that science can be a tool for bolstering social unity, it's also something that people use as a way to show that, there's actually quite rampant division within the community itself. And I mean, I think there are lots of other components to this, which I won't get into because I'm slowly running out of time. But I think the thing that really is important to me here is this weaponization of skepticism. So I think the public reactions to all of this has been super interesting. I think we've had lots of really great interactions with people like at the Department of Health and Human Services and the UK Prime Minister's office, and some press coverage, but I think we've also had some other maybe less savory press coverage. This is like the first page of stuff that I was like, okay to kind of screenshot. But I mean, I think one interesting takeaway for me was how a lot of the groups that I think we may be describing actually saw our paper as bolstering their practices. So MIT researchers admit that anti-maskers are more scientifically rigorous. For example, I think this is a really small slice of this kind of larger phenomenon. I mean, it really got to the point where you have like people close reading papers, which honestly, I'm just really flattered to be read in such detail. But I mean, so I think in a lot of these discussions, I think it's interesting that they often agree with a lot of the kind of descriptions that we have talked about. So like we often describe, the kind of process by which science unfolds within these kinds of analytical moves. And it really becomes this like larger showdown about like the place of science at institutions like MIT and Stanford and as practiced by lay people. So how dare us lay people deign to imagine that we might have the ability to grasp, study data, and formulate conclusions? I think this to me is a kind of larger question that I'm interested in exploring with a group about the kind of contested nature of like when you, how to educate, how to talk about like being an expert or spreading expertise or spreading like, correct knowledge, fact checking. I think these are all different components that I would really love to engage with. So what do we do from here? We should do things like call bullshit and try to approach data analysis in an intersectional way that helps us think about how we can use data science to fight existing inequalities and how to use it to speak truth to power. And with that, I will end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Crystal. And I just wanted to remind everyone real quick that there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, so please submit your questions through that, and we'll have the Q&A after our last panelist speaks, and I will introduce him now. So I want to welcome back Carl Bergstrom, who received his PhD from the Stanford Department of Biology, which is my department as well. Dr. Bergstrom is a professor of biology at the University of Washington and a faculty member at the UW Center for an Informed Public, who studies the flow of information through a wide range of biological and social systems. And as Crystal alluded to, he is the co-author of Calling Bullshit, The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World, which is based on a course he co-teaches. And he has also contributed to course materials that are used at over 100 colleges and universities to teach quantitative reasoning and information literacy. And there's a website with that name too, if you want to learn more. Throughout the COVID pandemic, he's been a prominent voice speaking out against misinformation and helping people understand the science. And I'm super excited that he's joining us today. So take it away.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation. And I also, thank you very much to my two fellow panelists whose talks were amazing and fascinating. And I can't wait to hear more about it in the discussion. I'll try to just give you sort of a quick overview of what I see is going on, more to set the stage for our discussion afterwards than anything else. My own background in this, as Mallory mentioned, is I've been very interested in misinformation and also particularly misinformation around science, and so I wrote this book about quantitative misinformation, and have been studying the ways that misinformation and disinformation can sort of penetrate the scientific world. And then when COVID started, I sort of got sucked into dealing with all the disinformation around around COVID. One more little Stanford nod down there. The way I see it was this, it was only a matter of time. We knew this was going to happen sooner or later. I spent the 20-aughts developing pandemic plans for what we knew was inevitable. Last year, our luck ran out. The COVID pandemic upended all of our lives. We all became critically dependent upon a field that few of us even knew existed prior to the pandemic, epidemiology. We all had to become epidemiologists in order to figure out how to live our lives, how to keep our friends and families safe, to imagine what was going to happen next, to sort of plan out the future, et cetera. And this was a very difficult thing to do. Let's see. And so in doing this, we were sort of relying on the media, social media and traditional media, to help us understand what was happening. But of course, there was all of this unreliable information flowing through those channels. And I want to look a little bit at why and what form that took, and then say just a few words about the kinds of things that we as scientists and other members of the public can do about it. So the fundamental problem was we began with this massive amount of scientific uncertainty. So we're looking at a virus that had never been in humans until late autumn 2019, until late autumn 2019. So we started out with all of this uncertainty about so many things that were absolutely central. All of these questions that at various times we did not have clean answers to. During the pandemic, and they were all sort of critically important to understanding what was going to happen and what we needed to do about it. And so that created this sort of uncertainty vacuum, and into that uncertainty vacuum came flowing all kinds of things. We started out in February of 2020 seeing these organized disinformation campaigns trying to discredit the Chinese government, stories about sulfur dioxide blooms over Wuhan that were used to claim that hundreds of thousands of bodies were being incinerated last February, a year ago February. We had disingenuous government messaging from our own government, claims that it was going away, that it was contained, that it wasn't going to be a serious issue in the United States. At the same time that we had, the CDC saying Americans need to brace for serious disruption to their lives. We saw a lot of fake studies and astroturfing being put out there, where you had groups purporting to be doing scientific analysis that was utter nonsense, hidden behind veils of cloaking of who was actually doing the work, who was behind it. And in many cases that was sort of never worked out. So we saw that sort of thing. Science contributed, right? There were a ton of dreadful preprints that were put out there. This is one that was posted early in the pandemic that claimed that there was a segment of the HIV genome within the COVID genome. There is not. That was debunked in 2 days by hard work of genomics researchers. But in those 2 days, it amassed one of the largest altmetric scores in history. So it received more press and social media content than almost any paper in history in 2 days before this was debunked and retracted from the archive. There was equally dreadful peer-reviewed work published. At left, we've got a paper that proposes a just insane mechanism by which 5G causes the spontaneous formation of virus-like particles in your body. Of course, it doesn't. The right, much more disturbingly, in the Lancet, we had a paper published claiming that people were dying at increased rates when they were treated with hydrochloroquine, that led to the cancellation of the hydrochloroquine trials. Turned out that, even though hydrochloroquine is probably not an effective treatment, those trials were canceled unnecessarily because there is no evidence that the data underlying this study actually ever existed. They appear to have been fraudulent. We've seen organized ignatogenesis. This is sort of, Robert Proctor, Stanford's Robert Proctor's idea of the creation, a deliberate creation of doubt to stave off regulatory action. So we've seen organizations, putting in, really quite high production value efforts, both in terms of, the materials that are being produced, but also the social media campaigns that are taking place, trying to create doubt about the various measures in order to stave off any kind of government action to halt the pandemic. I've seen a ton of sloppy reporting where the newspapers and websites and news stations just get things wrong, just get them straight backwards. Here they're saying that that immunity lasts for up to 3 months from COVID, which led to this, panic. What they really meant was that CDC had been studying it for 3 months and it lasted for at least 3 months, not up to 3 months. We see, overhyped press. Oh God, I hate that appearance of fact. We see overhyped press releases, sort of credulously repeated. This is one from just a couple of days ago where the University of Oxford massively overhyped a study that they'd put out that was then just repeated in the Guardian and BBC and other places, as if the whole thing were true. There are, of course, people that see crisis as a career opportunity on both sides of the aisle. There's a ton of cherry-picked studies and anecdotes. So we have, once the crisis becomes politicized, then because science naturally generates a range of different possibilities, you have people cherry picking, studies that happen to support their own point of view. And there naturally are, for any given topic, if you have 100 studies being published on it, you are going to have a range of outcomes. And if you pick only the ones that support your point of view, you can mount a case that makes it look like you have science behind you, even when the bulk of the science goes in the opposite direction. And then, of course, all of this is wrapped up in the authority of numbers, which people find intimidating to challenge. Numbers feel somehow like they're, they come straight from nature, they're objective, they're hard, and people don't recognize that there's enormous latitude in the way that people can collect and present numbers, even if they don't fake them. So this leaves all of us, with this critical problem of trying to understand the epidemiology of what's going on, but we're hearing a wide range of opinions online, and we don't know who to trust. And this is a devastating place to be in, because this is more or less the point of modern falsehood fire hose propaganda, the point being to spew out so much disinformation, mutually contradictory misinformation, that people give up on any hope of being able to get to the truth. So it's not to make people believe things that are false, but to make people give up on the entire idea that they can get to the truth at all. And we've inadvertently done this to ourselves during the COVID crisis. So this is sort of the catastrophe that we faced. And what we've got to do is we've got to help people see through all of the misinformation. And to do that, we got to figure out, how is it that we're going to clean up our information environment? So I just want to close with a couple of very, a small number of very brief suggestions, each of which has a much deeper conversation behind it that we can go into in the Q&A if we want. So, the first thing is, don't be intimidated by numbers. Don't use numbers to intimidate people. This is what my book is about. One does not need rigorous quantitative training to think about the design of a study, to think about whether the data that are being used are appropriate for the question that's being asked, to think about whether the conclusions that are being drawn are merited by the results of the study. Similarly, don't be part of the problem. Don't throw around statistics as a kind of power move. Critically accept uncertainty and acknowledge uncertainty. A lot of the problem, especially early on, was that there was so much uncertainty. People wanted certain answers. And this is kind of the uncertainty vacuum concept. I'd get these calls from news media, and they'd want me to let them know what the infection fatality rate was, and I wouldn't be able to give them a sharp answer, and so they'd go out to someone else who was willing to say that it was less than flu or more than Ebola, and you wouldn't get because that was not something that people wanted to hear. I remember very quickly one phone call I had with one of the major news networks. They said the CDC must be hiding something, because everyone I talk to there will only tell me that the infection fatality rate is between 0.5% and 5%. This was in early March 2020, and I was like, they're not hiding anything. They're telling you the truth, because that's all that they can narrow it down to at this point. You've got that exactly backwards, and what you need to do is stop finding someone who will tell you that it's 0.005% or someone who will tell you that it's 10%, and just listen to the people that are telling you that there's significant uncertainty out there. Critically, you got to weigh every study in the context of the full literature. This is, each study gets treated, and this is a natural problem in the way it's reported both on social media and in traditional media. Each study is treated as if it is a final definitive answer. And instead, as Natalie Dean says, it's a pebble on the scale in favor of one hypothesis or another. And so to help contextualize things for people is so important, whether you're writing in public, whether you're explaining things on social media. Say, hey, look, yeah, this Israel study came out and it looks really bad for Delta, but we've got to think about what's going on in Wales, what's going on in Canada, what's going on in other parts of the UK, and understand that we've got to look at that whole picture instead of one limited study when trying to estimate the efficacy of the vaccine. Question your sources. This is just standard information literacy stuff. Who's telling me this? How do they know it? What are they trying to sell me? Let's see. Be aware of this information landscape that I'm talking about. Be aware of all of the kinds of misinformation and disinformation that are out there. Be aware of the way that people use social media to try to sell different narratives. Be aware of how social media is itself complicit in all of this by using algorithms that promote content that keep us online by keeping us engaged and enraged rather than using algorithms that try to keep us informed. Just written a paper about this in PNAS, the stewardship of human collective behavior, if you're interested in the topic. And finally, outreach helps at all scales. We all need to be on board with this, whether you're talking to CNN or whether you're explaining things to friends and family on Facebook, around the dinner table, whatever it is. I think that one of the most crucial things we can do is just continue to be engaged as a community, continue to explain things in good faith to people and help them contextualize what's going on when you go back to that big picture that I described early on with the uncertainty vacuum and all of the conflicting messaging, and to help people see that we actually can get to truth is one of the most important things we can do. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much. And I look forward to our panel discussion.
Awesome. Thanks to all of our panelists. And I'm really excited to ask y'all some questions and follow up on some of the stuff that was discussed. So as a reminder, you can put your questions in the Q&A tab. There's an interesting conversation happening now about why vaccines are seem especially vulnerable to this kind of misinformation. So if y'all want to read that. But I'm going to move into the first question, which is from Monica. How do we get people to accept uncertainty when they don't want to? Confident-seeming people giving simple-seeming answers are comforting. Tribal allegiance through repeated talking points is comforting. How do we get people to care about truth and actual problem solving more than comfort or group membership? Anyone got thoughts?
It's not my area of expertise. I was hoping one of my co-panelists would speak in and give me the answer so that I would know what to do. I think it's very, very hard. I think one thing that we can try to do is to explain why there is uncertainty and be continually clear about the fact that it exists, because people do want to make the right decisions for their family. They do want to make the right decisions for their future. They want to understand what's going on. And if they're consistently, if we're able to consistently convey uncertainties, which is a very hard thing to do. And there's, of course, lots of studies about how to communicate uncertainties to the public, how to communicate in science, big topics. But I think one of the most important things we can do is to be upfront about that and continue to not oversell anything. And a lot of that, for me, involves focusing on the entire range of studies that are out there. And instead of saying like, oh, what does this new study mean? Say, oh, well, what this new study means is this new study is part of a suite of studies on infection fatality rates from a bunch of different places by a bunch of different methods. And, looking at them together, it seems like we're somewhere in this range, but they do differ from one another. And so we don't know where in that range they are because we're still working these things out.
And I might add just real quickly to tag on Renee DiResta, who's the project lead for the Virality Project and at the Stanford Internet Observatory, just put out, I think, a really relevant piece in Atlantic journal on, or in the Atlantic on this exact question of how you communicate evolving scientific consensus. And she actually interviewed someone from Wikipedia for this piece, or was discussing with someone from Wikipedia for this piece. And the idea is, if you make the actual evolution of the scientific consensus more transparent, you can proactively combat ideas that, this is a sort of closed door discussion or a sort of elitist scientific discussion.
Yeah, thanks for all of the other responses. And I guess I'm still trying to think about this question, because the meat of it, I think, is super fascinating. So, I mean, I do think in the question itself, there's a kind of tension between tribal allegiance and accepting truth and uncertainty. And I think in some ways it can be really difficult, because it seems like we are trying to get people to choose one or the other, or trying to get people to opt into one and ignore tribal allegiance. I think maybe a more culturally appropriate approach is to not see them as fundamentally separate, and to say, if you care about these people in this community who may or may not share views that I think are in line with public health guidance. Let me actually try to make that more concrete, because otherwise I'll get lost in the double negatives. But so let's say that you're talking to a family member who is hesitant to get the vaccine, doesn't think that masks are super necessary, and is in a community of people who are skeptical of the science coming out of the CDC, MIT, Stanford, et cetera. I think going to them and having that conversation as don't believe all of your friends and family, but you should accept the truth from these other people, can be a very difficult pill to swallow, because you're asking them to choose sides on who gets to legislate truth. And by explicitly denying their reality, I think can make that conversation dead in the water before you even really start. And so I wonder if one way to kind of approach that is to, in some sense, take them at face value, and to kind of understand the epistemological ecosystem in which they live. What is it that they think is legitimate? What is it that they care about? What is important to them? And how do you relate tangible steps like vaccination, or caring about other people via masking? How can you relate that to the cultural values that their community is interested in? So if it's about care, then maybe that's a way that you can talk about masking and mitigating harm to one's neighbor. Harping on the science in every single case may not always be the most effective. So it's about choosing a culturally and ecologically appropriate approach to those conversations.
Awesome. So next question is about the idea of, let's see, once misinformation content has gone viral, does removing it from a platform actually help contain the spread of misinformation? Does it give a visibility boost? Is deplatforming effective?
So I can take a stab at that. It's not my direct research, but work we've done at the CIP tracing some of the spread of misinformation does suggest that that can be effective at halting the sort of exponential spread of misinformation. Of course, there is the risk of some blowback. This was so true that it got censored kind of logic. Whether I tend to be uncertain about whether it is a good strategic move to remove information from platforms like that. But I think there is evidence that that it does halt the immediate trajectory of a particular piece of misinformation.
Awesome. Crystal?
Oh, my 2 cents is just to publicize Becca Lewis's work, also from Stanford, who answers this specific question about whether or not deplatforming and the algorithm, her work is specifically on YouTube, how it affects alt-right and other kind of misinformation. So I would definitely defer to her work on that.
What's the answer?
The answer is deplatforming works, but also it's not just about the algorithm. It's about like the fact that the content itself is
Yes.
radicalizing.
Yes.
Awesome. And kind of on that note, how do you debunk content or like prevent the spread of misinformation when you see it without amplifying it? And what are the best practices? And I wanted Chase to start out with that because I know y'all have like a disclaimer at the top of every report you put out.
Yeah, so at Virality Project, we have stayed away from being communicators ourselves, but we work with a lot of communicators, and some of the sort of general themes we like to focus on, which I think Carl noted on some of these really nicely already, is one to sort of focus on themes generally rather than elevating specific stories or specific incidences. Two, I think community context is crucial. So really being cognizant of who you're speaking to. I think, again, continuing to be upfront about the state of science, being upfront about uncertainty. We've seen this a lot recently with sort of questions around, if people who have previously had COVID need vaccines, there was at some point some scientific uncertainty. And then, not just using numbers, as Carl said. And I think one other thing I wanted to add was, Mike Caulfield, another researcher at UW, had a really great sort of series of blog posts recently on the idea of tropes in the anti-vaccine world. And one of the really interesting ideas he posed there that I've been thinking about recently is being sort of transparent and proactive when they're, anti-vaccine advocates are using a specific trope, maybe suggesting like focusing on that trope and saying, hey, you might be, this person might be trying to use this trope to sort of trick you into believing this misinformation. Because I think a lot of times when we realize someone's trying to trick us, that can be something that makes us listen.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was very thorough. The next question is about the role of the media. Particularly Dr. Bergstrom, in some of your slides, you had like these headlines. Are we not engaging them enough? What can we do to rein them in? And what is the media's role in preventing the spread of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, the media, are in an awkward position because they were dealing with a changing business model where they're switching from subscription-based revenues from subscriptions, but also subscription-based ad revenues to click-based ad revenues, where you have, instead of reading the New York Times and the articles are not head-to-head competition with one another, you pull up your iPhone and you grab the news on your iPhone and you see articles from 5 different outlets that are head-to-head competing. And so you'll have maybe a detailed analysis of how the vaccination plan going is, but beneath that is 7 cats that look like Disney princesses, and you click and you're off and going. And so the thing is that the unvarnished truth is no longer necessarily enough to get people to click. And so we see this tendency toward hyperbole in headlines, particularly. So, one thing we can continue to do is hold the media accountable. I do believe, and I have had very much the experience that at least when you have a certain level of prominence on social media, traditional media do respond, and they will change headlines, they will correct mistakes, they'll do those kinds of things. So the first thing really is just the straight up headline problem, that you have headlines that contradict the story written by someone who doesn't understand the story or who doesn't care. The very good media, maybe helping people, steer people to very good media sources and away from not so good ones. You have reporters like Helen Branswell who understand this situation and the landscape incredibly well, get a complete picture before writing anything, both from, say, her previous understanding, but also from, if a new study comes out, she's calling up multiple different experts that are unrelated to the study, kind of triangulating, figuring out what the evidence is, helping you understand how the pebbles are weighing on the scales. And so steering people toward that content and away from the latest, thing that's come out by someone who's taken a university press release, stamped the station's logo on it and sent that thing out. And then the third thing, I guess, is that for those of us who are scientists and are engaged in this, we are responsible for the content that the universities put out about our work in press releases. We need to step up and take that responsibility. We don't. We generally use that, we don't worry about it, or some people even use it as a way to sort of stress the implications of their study without making it so clear they're the implications. And then when someone calls you out, you just say, oh yeah, you know, those university press offices. We got to do better than that. We've got to make sure that we are responsible for every word that they put out about our studies, because that is where this information gets into the media. From the start, there are a whole number of studies that look at this, and very largely when there's misinformation in media stories, and quite to my surprise, it's there in the university press release as well. So there's just a few things we can do.
And we're running down to the wire on the time, but I'm going to try to get 2 more questions in. So the first is for everyone, but try to keep it short. We have a lot of questions about just what are best practices for debunking at the personal level, and then also like at the institutional level. So people have asked about the government, they've asked about academic institutions. So just like whatever you can say quickly, and I know that could be our next panel.
I'll answer this very, very quickly. Be brave. Be as brave as our moderator and my 2 co-panelists. They blow me away.
Thanks, Carl. I think my piece of advice was to read Carl's book, which answers that question in many, many chapters and in a very entertaining fashion.
Don't really have too much more to add, but I will say on Virality Project's website, we put up a blog post on promoting the idea of a center of excellence, where a proposal for how the government could have a sort of a debunking page, similar to how CISA ran one for elections in the fall.
Awesome. Thanks y'all so much. And my last question that I have here is so we have someone who's an early stage researcher in library and information science. Are there any particular topics or areas of research that would be worthwhile to focus on? And more broadly, if we're someone who maybe doesn't directly do this work, but wants to know more about it and incorporate it into the research that we do, how can we learn about it?
I think one of the most important things that we need to do very quickly is understand how humans make collective decisions when information flows through massive social networks of the scale of 2.5 billion people. Understanding that problem is going to be essential to solving any of the other problems we're facing. This has, been an enormous impediment to solving COVID, and it's going to be an impediment to solving climate change, war, racism, fascism, other kinds of problems that we're facing. So I'll post something into the links with a link to a paper we've written about this but I think this is the problem for our age.
Bouncing off that, I guess for me, it would be information retrieval, classification, and search. So not just about like the kind of information that we consume, but how do we seek out the stuff that we're interested in, and how does content come to us? So I feel like that is the crux of library and information science. So I feel like that's certainly something that everyone here is quite invested in.
Yeah, and I think the big question we always get is around the debunking and how to respond, and I think it's still a very big unanswered question. First Draft has a lot of good sort of information on the psychology of why misinformation is hard to debunk, but still not a lot of great answers yet about how to best do it. Just so I'd put that out there.
Awesome. Thanks y'all so much. And Crystal, it looks like someone is asking for a link to your interactive version of your paper in the chat. If you want to put the link there, to let everyone know the recording will be available. I'll share a link. Maybe I'll just send it out to everyone who attended. And I also wanted to say, if you're interested in learning more about this, there's actually an opportunity next month being hosted by Stanford, but it will also be virtual. It's loading on the screen sharing, but some folks in the Stanford School of Medicine are hosting a conference called Infodemic that is on these topics, and they're going to be talking. It's going to be a day-long seminar on how this misinformation is spreading online. Oh, okay, here it is. Yes.
So a conference on social media and COVID-19 misinformation. So as you can see, it's kind of hard to fit all this information into 1 hour. And we, Scientists Speak Up, which is our organization, is going to be helping host a panel for, it's probably going to be specifically for Stanford affiliates to talk about the roles that we have within this institution and what we can do to help prevent the spread of misinformation. So would definitely encourage registering for that. And I think that's all of the announcements that I have. Elisa, if you want to put back up our slide on Scientists Speak Up. I want to thank first and foremost our panelists, who I wish that I could just chat with for the rest of the day. But thank you guys so much for sharing your time and for the work that you do, which is so critically important. I want to thank the Graduate Student Council at Stanford for helping to support this event. I want to thank everyone who attended this event. I know that especially in July of 2021, it is like the highest honor for someone to willingly spend time on an hour-long Zoom. So, you know, I deeply appreciate it. And I know it's because we have these awesome panelists. And thank you also to everyone who helped share the event. Sorry we could not get to all of the questions, but feel free to reach out to us or to our panelists. And thank you guys again for joining us. Bye,
Thank you so
everybody.
much. Take care, everybody. Thank you for your time.
And let me see if I can figure out how to turn off. Is the recording off, Gina?